I'm good here. When I did inquire where Pastor Mbewe was, and I thought it was going to be delayed, so we said, well, there are those from Zambia who are living history that they would have also shared, so we're going to substitute him for 3 Zambians to cover Conrad. But now that he's around, so we won't do that. He will speak for himself together with Pastor Phil Hunt. Now, one of the things we'd like to do in this session is basically to hear what the Lord has been doing in Zambia, and it's a great joy to be standing from this side and asking the men that I've interacted with over the years in different towns. I grew up in Kitwe, where Phil Hunt is. He lives and working there, doing church plant, and also president of a Bible college. And then I've been a member of Kabwata Baptist Church for the last 15 years, and of those 15 years, have served with Pastor Mbewe. 7 years of the 15 I've been at Kabwata, I've been in the eldership. So it's a great joy to ask him questions, and if a question come in my mind that I've never asked him during working hours, I hope I could do that, but we'd like to hear from you. So as a way of starting, we'd like to hear just briefly about themselves. Maybe Phil can start. Just please tell us a bit about yourself and your family. What are you doing in Kitwe, and when did you come to Zambia?
All right, well, thank you. I told Conrad we better behave ourselves. If we fall off from this high, we're in trouble. But brief history. I was born the son of a pastor, and so heard the gospel from the time I was born. And God was very gracious to me. I don't know exactly when it was, but I do know that prior to my 5th birthday, I understood I was a sinner, and I repented of my sins and accepted Christ as my Savior. In my childhood, I was exposed to, of course, the gospel and scripture every day, but also to missions and missionaries and mission biographies. And I remember being deeply challenged by reading. I think probably the biggest challenge that I can remember as a kid was reading about the missionaries in Ecuador, Nate Saint and those guys, Jim Elliott. That really impacted my life in my preteens. I consecrated my life. I mean, God was working in my teenage years. I consecrated my life to the Lord to serve Him however He would choose. And I really hoped that would be missions. And that was when I was 16. And then God providentially led me across the country from the southwest of the United States to the New England area where when I was 20, worked in a church up there bivocationally and continuing my education. And there I met Lori. She was in the church. I remember our second date. I said to her, look, God's called me to ministry and I'm going to Africa. So if you don't think that's something that's good for you, then let's not waste our time. It was kind of it was kind of bold, I guess, but she said, she shared how the Lord had also, and when she was a teenager, led her to want to serve Christ in whatever way that He chose, and that she was up for it. Now, if she was here today, she would tell you she had no idea what she was saying that day. So our church commissioned us, and we raised the necessary support at that time and left the USA. I was 25. And Lori got on the plane in Boston. She was 22, and when she stepped off in Mombasa, Kenya, she was 23, and she said it was the worst birthday of her entire life. And so we spent 14 months in Kenya, intending actually to our whole goal had been the interior of Zaire. That's where we planned to go and to serve with missionaries there. But that period of time under the Mobutu regime, it was impossible. When we were ready to go, the airport was closed and everybody had been evacuated, and we just couldn't get in there. So we ended up in Mombasa for a period of 14 months. and then partnered together with a couple who was, at that time, probably old enough to be our parents, formed a team and moved to Zambia. We arrived in Zambia with an 8-month-old, Cherith, and God blessed us with 6 more children, most of them who were born in Kitwe. And so we are still living 26 years later in Kitwe by the grace of God. So it's a tremendous blessing.
Thank you.
This isn't part of it, but I met this guy 20 years ago. He was much thinner and much younger then.
Please. I want to know a bit about yourself, about you.
Okay, mine will be a shorter story since it's all about Zambia. Yes, I was born, raised, educated in Zambia itself, and the second part of that childhood was within Lusaka, the capital city. That's where I initially studied mining engineering, and then went to work in the mines on what is called the Copper Belt, which is where Phil is. And then while working there, I met my wife. She had also grown up in Lusaka, but we'd never known each other there. We just met in the local church where I was now attending. And within 3 years, Kabwata Baptist Church then called me to be their first pastor. While I was studying in Lusaka for my undergraduate years, we started Kabwata Baptist Church from Lusaka Baptist. So I was part of the team that was doing outreach work there. When they constituted and now we're ready to call a pastor, that's when they called me. So I quit my job and went there. That was in September on the 1st, 1987. So beginning of this month was my 31st. The Lord has since blessed us with 3 children, and the oldest is currently doing pastoral internship with us, intending to get into the ministry. And you know, the typical African home, we've also inherited 3 other children. And so we consider ourselves as having 6 children altogether. Thank you.
Thank you. So Pastor Mbewe, tell us a bit about the history of the Reform movement in Zambia, and what have been some of the joys in being part of the Reform movement in Zambia.
Yeah, I'll be very brief because it's definitely a long, winding story. But from what I gather, the impact of Reformation primarily came through Ban of Truth books that were coming into Zambia in the 1970s. But at that time, the few people that came to Calvinistic Reformed convictions did not in themselves have a sense of call to the ministry. And so they were trying to change their churches, as it were, from the pews, which, as you'll understand, is often very irritating to church leadership. So a number of them got excommunicated and so on, and nothing came out of that. But then a number of us got converted late 1970s, and in Lusaka Baptist Church, that is, and began to read the same Ban of Truth books that were widely available then, and began to come to Reformed convictions. We recognized the need to encourage one another after university days, and so it was really out of having a kind of backroom little conference that was meeting annually that a number of us began to sense the call to ministry. And to be more specific, Ronald, Cholwe, and myself, more or less at the same time, then answered God's call to pastoral ministry in different churches within a year. And, you know, we then took comfort and counsel and courage by our fellowship, informal fellowship. And it was really out of that we thought, look, we need to deliberately get our churches to take a reformed position rather than simply to be a conservative evangelical church. And we began what is now the August conference by 1990. That's when we had our first one as a rallying point for our churches, because they were all very small, 30 to 40 members at the most. And I think it was generally out of that the work then began to grow across the country. I think largely there would have been about maybe 6 churches at the most for a bit of that period, until the whole subject of missions began to grow among us. And out of that now, so that would have been like, 1990 to 94. And out of that now would be roughly 40 to 50 churches that are now scattered across the country and still multiplying. I think in summary, that's what I would say. Maybe when we come to question and answer session, I'll probably be able to say a little more.
All right, thank you. So I'll ask one more question, and I still have a lot of questions, but I'd like to open it up to the audience so that at least you ask those burning questions to try and find out what the Lord has been doing in Zambia over the years. Now, both of you have been involved in church plants, Lusaka, Kabwata Baptist, and all over Zambia. What are some of the strategies that you've used in the past, and especially planting churches in the poorer towns or areas of the Kabwata Baptist and Lusaka and beyond, and also in the rural parts of the country? What are some of the strategies that you've used in the past? And even last night we heard about being intentional about church plant.
From our side, with Faith Baptist Church of Riverside, where initially began, served there is the missionary pastor for about 14 years. There was intentionality as men came to Christ, and 2 Timothy 2:2, the faithful men. What is the key to this whole thing? It's faithful men. Bottom line, that's the key, both in identifying who they are, life on life, spending your life with men. And they're growing in their faith, in their walk, in their experience of serving Christ, and also keeping in front of our church the mandate to advance the gospel. So always, from the very beginning, keeping that in front of the church. And so as men came to Christ and were discipled, and as those years progressed, it really came from the congregation, burdens for communities. One across the river in a place called Kakolo, which would be a more rural area. And so the church came behind and organized a team of men who would cross over the river and evangelize. And eventually some people in that community professed faith in Christ. And they were organized into a Bible study that met on Saturdays under a tree for a good long period of time. And then one of the churches that had been planted in the compound that was coming into a more mature, gaining maturity. Francis Kaunda was the pastor of that church at that time, and so again he was doing the same thing with folks in his church. They were growing and developing a burden for missions. So there's a partnership between the two churches as we moved into the third church planting effort. So from the church to the rural area, and I'm not sure that that's always the best way. I'll just make one other comment. That Kakola church that I'm mentioning right now has since gone on and planted another church about another hour further out into the bush. And that was something where men were saved and discipled and trained informally within the context of that rural church, and came to maturity, and again, that natural desire to take the gospel to a community that didn't have it. So there's two different examples of the way that the gospel spread, at least in the context of our ministry.
Okay, thank you. I hope I won't forget the fact that Phil and the church is referring to at Riverside really partnered with us in one of our very first international church plants. So if I forget that, please, someone, when it comes to Q&A, remind me, because it's valuable with partnering to plant. For us, yesterday I was speaking about Paul and Barnabas not being intentional, but God was. We were guilty of the same. What we have done is not something we thought through, planned out, and now it is according to plan. That would be falsifying history. I mentioned the fact that the first was a church that was about to close down, asking us for help. And what I didn't say then was that although the two of us were elders in that church at that moment, were convinced we ought to help, the church refused. And it was a very bad church members meeting, you know, Baptists. Thankfully, the two of us were fairly resolved it was our duty. And so finally, in this stalemate, one of the members spoke up and said, you see, you elders, it looks like you don't want to listen to us. So you go and pray, and then let's see what Jesus will convince you about, and then come and tell us the following weekend. And that resolved the meeting. And as I said to somebody, I must confess we did not go and pray, because we didn't think there was anything to pray about. It was very clear what we needed to do. So we came back the following week, announced we're going ahead, and that was our very first missions effort to help this church about 300 or 400, about 300 kilometers south of Lusaka. The second was some brethren who were now attending our conference who could not stay in the kind of church environment they were in, so they asked us to establish a church in one of the poorest areas of Lusaka. So we went ahead to do that, and that then became our second church plant. And so it was really from there, you know, the requests coming out from other individuals that we began to think more seriously about church planting. We didn't have a church building at all. We're still meeting in a rented hall. So you can understand why the members were saying no at that point. I think the next level that got us going was now where we began to take on actual missionaries. And I think the first 2 or 3, that's the way it was. We were now running a small part-time college, and 1 or 2 of our students said, look, you know, where I'm coming from, clearly I won't have opportunity to fulfill my passion, and so on. And we knew the individuals, so the elders interviewed and sent out such individuals. So that was like the next phase that took us into more deliberate church planting, setting aside somebody's, supporting that person, and so forth. I then got a call from a gentleman that was about the year 2000, whom I had never met before. I didn't even know where he got my phone number from, and his name was Paul Washer. And he said, look, I've listened to your sermons, I like what I'm hearing, I'd like to enter a deal with you. It was a very dangerous deal, I must admit. He said, if you have men you want to send out for missions, and you don't have money, I'm willing to find the money and give it to you. Now, that's a very dangerous offer, especially to an African, free money. So that forced us to get to the drawing board to be intentional now, because you don't want somebody giving you money and then you're just waffling around. So it's what caused us to then work out what we call a missions policy. How are we going to go forward as a church leadership? And it took us about 6 months. But we finally got something in place, and we now deliberately wanted to ensure that Zambia is like a cross in terms of the main roads, from Livingstone going to Kabwata, and from the west going all the way to the east, from Angola to Malawi. And we deliberately wanted to ensure that any capital of the province that didn't have a reformed work, that we plant one there. And then also in this sort of cross, any major town that did not have a reformed work, we planted one there. So that's where we started from, which has almost now been completely done. So if you go south to north, east to west, you will have Reformed Baptist churches right across. In the midst of that, this is where he came in. We also began to sense the need to spill over into neighboring countries. After all, the issue wasn't money anymore. It was the right men to do the work. And our first effort was in Botswana. We sent out a missionary from Zambia, and Brother Phil's church partnered with us to support that. And then came Namibia. We've also planted in Malawi, and now, yes, after that, we then, as an intentional thing, said, any English-speaking country in Africa with a capital city without a reformed work, let's deliberately plant a church there. So that's the kind of phase we are in. I need to include two quick things. One is related to Brackenhurst. And it's the fact that, I'd been invited to preach in missions conferences, usually in America. I'll preach there and come home thinking, well, that's a good idea. Then I was invited to do a missions conference here in this church. And I've never forgotten, while I was going through the missions conference, I was sending messages back home to our church elders saying, guys, we can do this. We can actually have a missions conference in Africa. And I can't remember which month it was, but it was towards the end of the year. And we agreed that the beginning of the following year, we have our own missions conference. And I must admit that took us into the next phase, because now our missionaries could come back and report what was going on, and then we could actually raise a lot of money at once within the membership towards missions, and then have members commit themselves to monthly giving to missions. I mean, that has completely transformed Kabwata Baptist Church in terms of its missions work. So I needed to throw in Brackenhurst because we've never looked back since. And then we adopted an internship program where every year we now have a maximum of 6 interns. And as these interns come in from different countries of Africa, it's helping us to get to know these men. And if the elders are convinced that there is substance that we can then work with to send out as missionaries, that we can do that in terms of sending them back to their own countries as missionaries. And that's what has brought us into the current phase. That's how we've been able to plant a church in Sierra Leone and also currently in Nigeria. And we now have interns from Namibia, Zimbabwe, and Uganda that again we are looking at to see the possibilities. So I think that's how we found ourselves where we are now. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me invite if there are any questions from the audience. Okay, there's a hand there. Is the mic nearby?
I was busy taking notes. The hand is there.
Thank you. My question is relating to certain people groups that only speak certain languages that may not be English. So in terms of church planting, I guess earlier yesterday, or was it this morning, they were talking about effectiveness of planting churches that aren't say, homogeneous, but at the same time you want to be effective in reaching out to a local, say, native speaking people. So how do you deal with reaching out to people who don't speak English, but you also want them to see the importance of not being closed up to just the people that they know, and to open up to the possibility of having a church that where people from other countries can attend, or people who don't necessarily speak their own language.
So she's basically saying, you said something about planning to have a Reformed Baptist in the capital cities of the English-speaking countries. So that's basically what you're saying, isn't it? We're asking. So, and then also the fact that this morning we're being told that we should not just be thinking of one people group, but the gospel must go to all the nations. So I would like to hear comment as well, I think, from Kabwata Baptist Church.
Okay, I think first of all, for instance, in Lusaka alone, we've planted 6 churches. 3 of them are not English speaking. So what we basically do is to encourage that the language of the people in your community, when 2 people meet in the streets and begin talking, try and ensure that that's the language in the church. There shouldn't be a language barrier between what's going on inside and outside. So that's the first thing. Similarly, in Zambia, on the western end of Zambia and on the eastern end of Zambia, there are 2 totally different languages. And they are not, although they can understand English and they learn English in schools, but it's not the English they speak in the streets. So we encourage them to use the language of the area. So that's really the approach. So in those places you'll find different languages altogether, similarly with South and North. However, the intentionality of going into the English-speaking countries is simply because that's the language we know. And therefore we have thought to ourselves, let's at least do that much. Now granted, if we have the opportunity to have somebody, say, from Portuguese-speaking countries or French-speaking countries, remember, God is sovereign. You can't package him and keep him tightly in a box. So whereas, yes, we need to be planning and praying and moving forward, he has his own agenda, he has his own timetable, and consequently might surprise us with people in that category. The reason why, again, we're targeting capital cities is because we would like, as I was preaching last night, that to be the hub for further church planting. Whereas if you go and start in a small corner somewhere, it tends to be more difficult for the church to spread within that entire country. So I think it's more strategic thinking, but we definitely would be open to the Lord surprising us.
All right. Team there, the hand is up, and then our brother Donovan there at the back.
So how much of what you've described, Conrad or Phil, is a larger mother church busy planting, which then begs the question, why do we need an association? Or do larger churches outgrow an association? How much of the planting is a strong mother church versus various churches together partnering to plant? What would your input be on that?
I mean, I'll make a brief comment. I see both happening. In the initial stages with what the Lord has led up in Kitwe, it was more the mother church model birthing several other churches. But then as those churches have come to maturity themselves, you now see a partnership. So there was partnership with Kabwata, but now there's just a natural partnership for the planting of other churches. So I would say in the early years it was a mother church, and now it's much more shared, although probably in the 11 or 12 churches that have been planted, one church would probably own it, but not the same one. Ascending church, yeah. They would own the responsibility. If the funds aren't coming in or the missionary needs something, that's where they go to. That's where the accountability lies. That's the Antioch, so to speak. And yet there is a shared. And the joy for me of a conference like this is the burden. My burden, I think our burden up there, is that partnership goes beyond just that initial growing network of mature churches. And there's so much more that can be done with like-minded brothers, especially if we're going to go across borders. It's a whole nother dynamic, and somebody mentioned that, maybe it was him in a message. It's a whole nother dynamic. It's one thing to plant even in the rural areas or a few hundred kilometers away. It's another whole thing to send someone across the border into really another culture. And I think that's where this partnership broader partnership is so valuable. In my opinion, the Archbishop will correct me if I'm wrong, but in my opinion, you still have ascending church, right? I mean, even in that, there has to be a local church that is responsible for that cross-border effort, but then it allows others to partner.
Yes, I would simply say amen to that. I think the moment you start thinking in terms of further distance, you often realize you need other churches to work with and other like-minded churches. The goodness with like Solar 5, for instance, is you have a network where you can say, guys, we're thinking, like yesterday, we're talking about Zimbabwe. There's someone being sent there. Already, you are able to interact with others, and you may find that they have individuals who are already there, they have perhaps some finances, etc. So you are able to do a lot more together, especially because of the distance. But clearly there is one church that has sent out the individual, and that person's primary accountability therefore remains with that church. So I echo what he said.
All right, so we'll allow for Donovan and then we'll move.
I'm just wondering, as the church planting efforts have progressively moved from hubs to areas of lower income, going more rural, what are some of the challenges you've faced, and how have you overcome those challenges?
So added to that is you talked about doing some work in some of the poor areas in Lusaka. I'll have ensured that those churches are self-governing and self-supporting, but also those churches going further to plant other churches. And I think also Phil talked about going across the Kafue River and planting churches that have continued to plant churches.
Yeah. I mean, clearly that's the issue of finances and economics come into play there. And it's something that we continue to wrestle with. I think in terms of in principle and also in theory, we are very clear. For instance, in principle, we know that we should aim for self-governing and self-supporting churches. We don't want to compromise on that. We don't want rural churches or churches in poorer areas perpetually depending on some handouts. So in principle, we're clear. In theory as well, I think we are equally clear that the membership of the church should see it as their responsibility to support the activities, and also especially where they have a pastor, the pastor who is there. I think again in theory we we are quite clear and tend to teach that. I think the challenge tends to come in with respect to two things. One is initially you had a pastor who, whether the members gave or not, everything was still okay. After all, he was being supported from elsewhere. Now the changing of gears tends to hurt the pastor, because as you're withdrawing, for some reason the members still think that there's manna coming from somewhere. And we tend to be very hard. We're very clear that we are not God, so we didn't call the person, it's God who called him. Therefore, the missionary primarily trusts the Lord rather than trusts Kabwata Baptist Church. And a time comes when we must withdraw so that the local church becomes a real local church. And then also we argue for the fact that in the poorer areas of the city, you have different dynamics to poorer areas in the rural areas, for instance. So there, for instance, members can donate a goat, which might keep the pastor's family chewing for some time. In the poorer areas of the city, there are no goats to be donated. It's blue-collar jobs. And so the point is the church leaders in those areas have to think through the best model that they can use to keep those churches managing their own situations. So the most we encourage beyond that is we encourage their own annual conferences, where we continue paying for the speakers in terms of transport, honorarium, and accommodation. But it gives them the opportunity to discuss these issues so that in their own context, they are seeking to find long-lasting solutions so that the answers are not coming from us. Thank you.
Phil, do you want to say something about about the church plans beyond the Kafue River, or that's fine?
Okay, maybe, sure, briefly. Yeah, that transition is very hard, and I think that churches in the city, churches of means, really have to be careful, because we can breed the same dependence that we see when Westerners come and do something. It can be the exact same thing in the minds of the church, which leads to a very weak, unhealthy church that's unable to reproduce itself. In the little network that's developing where I am, I would say that those who are pastoring in compounds in rural areas are all bivocational, and yet the church is also giving. So it's a mix, but the church giving isn't going to maybe sustain the pastor to the level that is required, but the church has ownership. The churches that plant, I think the one way that we can help is with infrastructure, buildings, property, and yet even there we must be careful. Never develop the ministry beyond the capacity of the mature congregation, or you saddle them with something that they can never maintain at the same level. It requires you forever, and I think that's done well-intentioned often. It wasn't intended that we keep them dependent, but it is. I mean, in the rural area, people can burn bricks, right? So they ought to burn bricks. They may not be able to buy the metal roof sheets, but they can burn their own bricks. So it's just that wisdom by the planting churches to be able to shepherd that whole process. And it's not easy. It really isn't easy. There has to be a man that knows he's called and is willing to sacrifice and do whatever it takes to advance the glory of God.
Okay.
This question is about training. Phil, you mentioned that at one point there was a group that you were informally, or were being informally trained. in the work of church planning, at what point are you making decisions for the official as opposed to the informal training? And are you speaking about, because I assume there was, because you mentioned it was informal, I assume there was a type of formal training. What are you speaking about there? And at what point in church planning did you decide for a formal training institution or program?
Yeah, I mean, the training of men, right, 2 Timothy 2:2, the training of men in whatever form, and I think it's multiple forms, is key. To teach faithful men who will be able to teach others also. So there is an informal nature to that. It doesn't mean that it's not organized, but they're not off at a Bible college, or perhaps you may be working in a rural area where, from an academic standpoint, the brother couldn't go to a college, a formal, and yet he knows Christ and he has great aptitude. And so the pastor or the network of pastors coming in and being able to teach, some of that has been more structured now in the terms of going in and offering block classes, week-long training. But informal, I think it's a responsibility of the pastor or the church planting team to be able to intentionally instruct them in the Scriptures day after day, right? And there's an intentionality about it, but it's not formalized. And then as you discover people and faithful men and the aptitude, there obviously is the need for maybe some more deeper or formal training. And so, I mean, that was the burden obviously behind Central Africa Baptist College and Seminary opening in 2006. We had reached that point where there was a need for a serious-minded, theological, deep, academically sound offering, and that's how CABC came into existence. So I don't think it's an either or. I think that often it's a process, but we must be careful that we don't think that it requires graduating from a Bible college or a seminary, and if you can't reach that level, you're not qualified to pastor a church somewhere. I don't think I would, but he must be trained. Right? So training must happen.
All right, and then we'll move there.
How many churches that you know of do not use English, use an African language for their worship?
I think I need to understand that question a little more first. I mean, how many churches do I know?
How many, you mentioned 40 to 50 churches, which is
really
a constant reason we praise God. We're very grateful. I just leaned over to Lalo and said, what an answer to prayer, and we want to see that in all the countries. How many of the churches that either of you know of are using an African language for their worship and their ministry?
Okay, thank you. So you're talking of those churches. All right. Zambia currently has about 10 provinces. The churches that are along that road I spoke about, when you go from the south, going all the way to the Copper Belt, almost all of those would be using English. The churches that are on the western end and the churches all the way from Lusaka to Malawi, they all use the vernacular language. We've just entered the northern part of the country, and there, because we are still in the two provincial capitals, they are using English. But it's fairly certain that the moment they branch off, it will have to be in the vernacular. So out of we've planted between 25 and 30 churches now. I would safely say between 8 and 10 would be using one of the vernacular languages. And then probably 15 plus would be using English as the primary language. Some of them are using both, because again they are mindful that there are individuals who've come into that town who are professionals and they are working there, and they haven't acclimatized to the local language. So they have translation happening there. We clearly don't dictate it from Lusaka. As I said, it's the environment that ought to dictate what the language is. We just want to avoid a situation where language becomes a barrier to the gospel, and you don't want that. Yes.
So there are 13 churches that have been planted that are using the
13,
local language. Yes.
Yeah, that's the advantage of having a younger pastor working with you. He has the figures.
So you're right.
Okay, my question relates to your, yeah, my question relates to your missions policy. Obviously the goal of, church planting is you want a church to be self-supporting and self-sustaining and that sort of a thing. And initially when you send off a missionary, I mean, there's some support that is given, but can you give us at least like a time frame in which you support the missionary, or you start decreasing? What is the time frame in terms of the support? And then the second question also maybe still relates to the missions policy or your internship, just in terms of obviously practically, when sending out a man, you obviously have to test the man and see that he's a man of character. But also doctrine is very, very key in terms of that. Now I was just thinking perhaps if a young man has potential, but perhaps may differ, has some sort of theological differences perhaps to Kabwata, perhaps a continuation, or you know what I'm saying, end time theology or something like that, would you still send him out and be in support, or is that really something you'd consider trivial? You'd still support him? How do you deal with that, or have you encountered something of that nature?
Okay, let me begin with the last one, because we certainly are very hard on the fact that church planting is reproducing yourselves. And therefore, anybody who comes, and we've just said no to an individual recently who trained in South Africa, tried to get support abroad, and the people that were willing to support him gave the condition that he has to come under us if they're to support him. But thankfully, he was open enough to say, look, in terms of the gifts of the Spirit and so on, I'm typical Pentecostal. But hey, we can work together. And we said no, because missions work is about a mother giving birth to children. And we want to see something of our convictions being multiplied for the good of the church. There are partnerships that we support where it's under a sister church. We may not agree with all the details, but we can see that it's a conservative evangelical church, and consequently the areas of difference we can live with. So in that sense, as a church, we are willing to help with finances so that that church can do its work. It's a sister church, but not ourselves planting that church. So that's on the first question. With respect to the first, that's where I think we have the greatest difficulty, especially with our missionaries, because although we don't have the time frame in our policy, it is still something we function with. So when we're sending out somebody, we normally say, for the first 4 years, we'll support you 100%. And then the next 4 years, we begin to reduce 25% per year. But in us reducing, we're hoping that the church you're planting will fit that 25% in, so that your own support isn't therefore going down. And so that's the way we work. It's not set in concrete, although it's almost set in concrete. In other words, if in the course of time individuals leave for work purposes, or in the course of time there's a split, and it's a doctrinal split, we are willing to review. Or if the missionary leaves and then somebody else takes over, again, we're willing to review. But that's the kind of time frame we normally work with, an 8-year period.
All right, so move from Jethro to Chris Nguni and Zax, and then go at the back, and then come to Tanaka.
Thank you.
Now, if you have 2 questions, you warn me in advance, so that then I ask either you ask one, or you say which of the 2 would you like to ask for now, in the interest of time.
Thank you. You mentioned like the initial introduction of the Reformed faith. Now, my question is, what were your experiences? I mean, what are your challenges as you introduced the Reformed faith to the areas where the Reformed faith was foreign, and how did you deal with those challenges?
Well, I think first of all, with respect to ourselves, when we launched out initially, we were not Bible college trained, and we were young. We were in our mid-20s. So clearly our own people were being warned that we are taking them to a cliff edge, and there'll be disaster before long. And also there was the blackmail that Reformed churches don't grow. They become stagnated, then they shrink, and then they die. So a lot of our own members were quite concerned about that. And so the first few years were difficult, primarily because you can't totally insulate your members. They are mingling with people out there, so they're being told this, and you can't miss the anxiety that is there. But praise the Lord, we stuck it out and have continued. With respect to church planting, I think, first of all, it doesn't matter what church you plant, even without the Reformed label. The stigma of Satanism is soon placed on these guys. So the first year, 2 years, that's the accusation. These are Satanists who've come. And invariably, especially the pastors' wives, are hurt because, this is what they're calling us, and so on. So they tend to go through that rather difficult period. We also seek to avoid the cultish attitude. In other words, we are the only ones who are right. Everybody else is wrong. It's in degrees that you have differences. And so where there is that cultish attitude, clearly the missionary and his work suffers unnecessarily. And so we seek to mature our men to engage with the community, to relate to other pastors, while being very clear that this is who we are doctrinally. Again, evangelism is evangelism. You don't go out and say, hey, we are Reformed. Do you know what Reformation is? I mean, that's not the way you evangelize. I'm a Christian, are you a Christian? And so on. So where the emphasis is in the right place, I think once that Satanism stigma wears off, I think the progress would be the same progress that would take place in any conservative evangelical context. Some of the problems tend to be not just the phrase Reformed, but a stereotyped form of worship. So, you are in a rural area and you still want to use a hymn book printed in London with all the ancient hymns alone. Clearly you are sticking out like a sore thumb, or the elbow sticking out. And our men have to mature to realize that there will be differences that are largely cultural. You are where you are. Don't try and become Kabwata Baptist Church where you are. So we will respect that aspect. And I think where that happens, again, there is an easier church planting situation than where somebody is simply wanting to replicate KBC in everything. I think that's what I would say. So it's the stigma, and then if it's in rural places, it's money issues also that tend to cause the work to stifle a little longer and so forth. Otherwise, it's just the normal challenges of planting a church in any context that you will be in. So there's somebody who said, either the day before yesterday or on the first night, I can't quite recall. In fact, it may have been even Phil, I can't recall. He used the phrase that sort of hit us between the eyes, the phrase, missions work or church planting is easy or something. Do you remember anything like that?
It's Phil.
It's him, eh? Okay, good. I finally have to quote him. And that point is so valuable. I think sometimes we torture ourselves too much. That before we get out there, we have to have everything right. And in the end, we don't do it. So please, in the midst of all these questions, that's why I began by saying KBC did not start having it right. We were not intentional. The Lord pushed us there. So I want to say the same thing to all of us here. Get out there and do it. I hope you won't mess up, but do it. And the Lord, by His Spirit, will enable us to get things right.
Thank you. All right. I think there were 3 hands here, so we'll allow
I
for
hope
that.
something for...
Because you said something in the end. So please, let's be quick, because we're heading towards lunchtime.
Yeah, my question is, at your early stage of the plant, what were the strategies that you used to evangelize? What were those that seems to work? What were those that you turn away from? You thought they were not really helpful, and this is supposed to include as well field hand in the compound as well. Thank you.
Okay, something Phil said in his sermon, which I hope you didn't miss, when he came to the issue of evangelism, he spoke in terms of not just the missionary evangelizing, but getting the people to be so in love with the gospel of Christ, or better still, the Christ of the gospel, that they want to share Him. That's something that we had to develop, at least in our context as a church, as a culture, but which we really encourage our church plants to do as well. Because one person only has 24 hours in a day. 10 people together have 240 hours in a day. And consequently, you can do so much more when you are multiplying yourself into the people that you're discipling. And consequently, as Phil said, they love the gospel, and consequently it's the outworking of that is further church plants. But it's exactly the same with the local churches. So it's not just the preaching that's taking place on a Sunday or on some special meeting on Saturday, but literally the members using different fora, different approaches, but really seeing evangelism as this is the Christian life. I think once that happens, yes, you have an exponential opportunity for growth. Over to you, Phil.
Yeah, I would say, man, one of the core philosophies stated in the ministries all these years has been everyday evangelism. I mean, from day one, everyday evangelism, and that's really what we're talking about. That because at least my background, where I came from, everything was programmed. It was all, and that may be what you're asking. What programs can we do to do evangelism? Yeah, okay, you can have the youth rally, and I think that all those things, camps, it should do those things, those are fine. But if your people think that evangelism only happens when you have a program, or we have a Saturday visitation program, nothing wrong with that. I think that's helpful to organize. Some people won't do it unless you have some intentionality. But if that's what they think evangelism is, you've really missed the boat. So, yeah.
Yes, as we heard from Pastor Semis yesterday's sermons, so how many churches did you revitalize in Zambia, and what were the practical ways in which you have done that?
Was that in English or? So just say it slowly.
Okay. How many churches did you revitalize in Zambia?
Oh, revitalize.
Yeah,
okay.
Revitalize, yeah. And what are the practical ways in which you have done that?
Yeah. In fact, when our brother Sammy was preaching, I remember taking note that the sad thing about those of us who are Reformed is that we are sometimes very proud, so that when your church is dying, your theory is that God has hardened everybody else, and therefore you are the last men and women standing. That pride insulates you from help, because whereas other Reformed works are bursting at the seams, you are now trying to find another explanation for why they seem to be bursting at the seams, other than the fact that, in fact, they can help you to grow, to turn around and head in the opposite direction. And consequently, apart from the very first one that I mentioned, where they actually came out to us and said, send us preachers, and we began to send preachers, and then from there they said, look, can we come under your oversight? Apart from that, again, perhaps Peter might be able to help me. I cannot think of any other that reached out to us in that way. I think all the rest that we may have done, he'll correct me if I'm wrong, have been works that have developed from scratch. But perhaps another reason might be that without a formal association, we've become like one big family of churches. And consequently, our pastors are constantly crisscrossing the country, preaching in different churches, handling seminars, conferences, workshops, and so on, so that without a church specifically saying, come out and help us, there is a whole army of preachers and teachers to call up to help. We have helped a few churches financially, especially when they are calling their first pastor, or maybe even a second one, and they don't have the financial muscle. We would say, fine, we'll help you for a year, and no more, unless you can convince us after that 1 year why we should still help you. So in that sense, coming alongside, but it's purely financial. They are able to manage everything else. And thankfully, the 1 or 2 cases I can think about, before you even finish the year or 2 years, they're saying to you, fine, actually, we won't need your help beyond this point. I think those would be the few cases where it has happened. But I want to repeat, we know at least a number of cases where I have taken the initiative together with my fellow pastor. We've gone to the leadership and we've said, can we have a meeting with you? And they would say, why? Well, we want to help. Okay, we'll get back to you. 1 year later, you say, again, we've been waiting. And then, what's the agenda? So, there's not much you can do there. It's clearly pride. You can't help. Thank you.
All right, there are 4 hands that I'll allow, and then after that, please, they're still around, so you can ask your questions in the interest of time, and then I'm a man under authority, so I need to obey those that are above me. So 1, 2, then there are 2 hands there, then after that, at least we can break for lunch, and then you can see them later in the course of the day. So after Tenaka, then at the back there, and then two hands here, and then we'll end for now.
Okay, thank you so much for all the information and everything that we've been learning in the conference. Our church is in Dubai and is so encouraged by the work being done in Zambia. So praise God for that and for the faithfulness of you brothers. It's a real inspiration. I just have a quick question. We know that you guys get people that you train, and usually you send them usually to plant churches. So keeping in mind yesterday's message on church revitalization, what are the sort of, I guess maybe issues or even practical issues you think through when maybe deciding to send someone to plant a church or to go back to their own church to, I guess, revitalize it? Are there any practical issues that you would think through? I guess keeping in mind where you might start a work where there already is something happening. Yeah, so I don't know if, is that clear? Is the question clear? So, okay, thank you.
Well, I think that, I mean, I'm speaking on behalf of other brothers because I'm not in charge of this thing up there. So I hope you understand I get to be here, but there's other brothers who I'm speaking on behalf of. But I think that they would say that they would not go into an area where there is a sound biblical gospel preaching church to plant another church. I mean, that would be, so that would take care of the majority, I think, of the question that you're answering from ours. There's so many communities and places where there is no bright gospel witness. There's so much heresy and the charismatic heresy and all of this that, I mean, why would you go in, even though they're not your maybe closest brothers, right? And without naming any names, but they're preaching the gospel, and they have a passion for the. Why would you go in next door and plant another church? Why, I mean, now maybe there's a reason for that, but I don't think any of the brothers that would think that would be a healthy thing to do.
Yeah, the only addition I'd like to make is, at least those who go through internship with us, it soon becomes clear that there are no secret formulas. It's evangelism, discipleship. Evangelism, discipleship. Keep to the word, evangelizing and building individuals. Because when they are with us, by 3 months, they're already noticing that there's no little secret something that's working here. It's straightforward. In fact, I remember one Pentecostal brother who began attending our evening services, who after about 2 months of attending evening service consecutively said to me, now, Conrad, I still haven't found, what is it that you are using to bring in these people? You know? I sit through your services, there's nothing, but they keep coming. And I think once people realize that there's no secret formula, yes, then wherever they will go, they just have to pay the price for evangelism and discipleship.
And maybe to cap that, just ministry, church planting, or whatever you do, it's work. Paul said the work of ministry, literally labor to the point of exhaustion. To give your 100%. God's not interested in 50 or 80% of your efforts. If you want to see, you labor in the work of ministry. If you want to see God's blessing and a sound church develop.
Thank you.
My question that I want to ask relates to the financial challenges in church planting. So I wanted to ask, in your own context, what are practically, how have you got churches in villages that are poorer, that cannot support themselves, involved in planting other churches in other villages that are poorer? So how have you done that to get the churches involved in church planting, which are there in the villages but can't support themselves without the dependency on the mother church?
I think I reject the premise. The premise is they can't support themselves. Yes, they can. It says they can't support themselves to the level of your church or your community. They can support themselves, and they must. And so the leadership that's there must recognize the dynamic and the situation that they're in. And as soon as you say they can't, you will never have a healthy reproducing church. They will never reproduce themselves because they can't. But in some of the instances up where I'm at, they actually have. It doesn't look the same. It takes a long time, but they're planting other churches. So there's one that the village church has planted, and I just was talking to the pastor out there, and they've already targeted another area in the other direction, and they're hoping in the next year to start sending some of their people over there to share the gospel. So that's not specific, but I think the premise, I just don't believe the premise is correct.
All right, the last two questions, as hope. I think let's take those questions after you ask, before they answer, then we'll allow for the last questions. Just please, I know you're above 50, you may not remember the question, but please pay attention. Gilbert, what has happened? Your question is gone. Maybe
I'll just...
yes.
Well, it's hard to find the one question I've asked, but maybe just to... I wanted you to elaborate on self-governance. The balance between the self-governing church and the pastor's accountability to the sending church. I wanted to find out your wisdom in that, because I don't think you're only talking about financial self-governance financially. I'm talking about maybe avoiding a church removing themselves from you. How do you avoid it? What things do you have in place to avoid such situations, and just some wisdom on it?
Please don't answer. Yeah, him behind Tim. I thought your hand was up. Oh, okay. All right, please. Then you can answer, and then our brother Stuart will come make some announcements, and then also pray for us and giving thanks for lunch.
Yeah, well, I think first of all, we have a model for church planting, and the understanding is that the person we are sending out is a member of Kabwata Baptist Church. So he's under the oversight of the church. Consequently, if he was to do anything wrong, he would be disciplined like any other church member. But also, we are generally a family, and consequently, there's a sense of belonging that the person has, that the church has. So we don't just tie them down using laws. It's the way in which any family has a sense of belonging. Like the way that the Solar 5 churches here, we're enjoying fellowship. So there is that reality as well. Then, as soon as possible, we do want to have a localized accountability. So as soon as possible, the missionary begins to develop some leaders around them, a number of things tend to be handed over to them. For instance, our missionary's own salary begins to go through that church's account. It's all part of enabling that leadership to learn how to handle its finances and so forth. So yes, the affairs is some work out smoothly, others are tough. A missionary fails to get paid because the leaders use the money for the youth camp. So, things like that tend to happen. But it's again part of the development of the work. We haven't had a case of we haven't had a case of an actual breakaway. No, we haven't had. So that doesn't happen. And I suppose because what motivates us is truth. It's truth we want to see multiply. So we're not developing a kingdom around ourselves. When those churches are weaned off, they become sister churches. They govern themselves. So in that sense, there's no, hey, what's happening there? You ought to do. No, we have mutual respect beyond that. Thank you.
Okay. Well, Conrad and Mbewe will both be around if you want to try to catch them at lunchtime and ask further questions. But thank you for that. And certainly we'll continue to pray for the work in Zambia and trust that you'll continue to pray for us. Just two things very quickly.